Discussion. Steve and I, when we get a chance to speak, we often prefer to answer questions because we think that's when the dialogue gets much more interesting. So we'll spend a little bit of time sort of introducing what we did and how we got to it, and then I'll talk for a few minutes here and talk much more eloquently than I will, and then we'll do some Q&A. The place that I thought we would start, though, was just to give you a sense of how this came up for us. As was mentioned, we're both investigative reporters at ESPN, and I had been there. Neither of us had done any work on this issue of concussions in football until I got assigned a story at ESPN to work on a piece about a former Minnesota Vikings player named Fred McNeil. And Fred had played about a dozen years in the NFL. For the Vikings, and he actually saw his football career really as almost a preamble to a second career as a lawyer, something that could almost help finance his way to get to law school and then become a lawyer. And he did that very successfully. He retired from the Vikings and then launched a career as a lawyer in which he became a partner in several firms, and in fact at one point was litigating cases for his former teammates who were suing the Vikings or other teams for workers' compensation payments based on the injuries that they had suffered from playing football. So Fred had had a very successful career as a lawyer, but by the time that I ran into Fred and had been assigned to look at Fred's life, he no longer was a practicing lawyer, but not only that, he no longer really could take charge of his life in any way. Fred had early onset dementia and really had a pretty good memory of his football career, but when you began to talk to Fred about things he'd done yesterday or ask him about his calendar or his schedule, he was lost. His life was being run by this point by his ex-wife and his two young sons who were in their early 20s. And it was a heart-wrenching couple of days that I spent with Fred, seeing just the dramatic changes that had gone on in him, hearing from his family just the difficult nature of how they'd seen this man literally transformed before their eyes, just losing his identity. In the course of doing the reporting on Fred, I went to West Virginia and I met with a doctor named Julian Bales. And if you end up reading our book or watch this documentary that's based on the book, you'll see Julian Bales. And he's a famous neurosurgeon. He's at the very beginning of the book, actually. And Bales was our sort of expert to go to for this story. And when I met Dr. Bales, we began to have sort of an informal conversation, and he said, are you going to do a book on this topic? He had read this book that I had done previously with a colleague, Game of Shadows, based on steroids and sports, and he said, you should do a book on this. And I said, well, no, surely somebody else is doing a book on this topic. By then, there had been coverage of the concussion issue in football. Some of our colleagues at ESPN had done fantastic work. The New York Times had done some very important and groundbreaking work. GQ, a magazine, the magazine had done two very important stories on this issue, really moving the ball forward. And I said to Julian, well, no, one of those people has to be doing a book. And he said, no, I really don't think so. So I came back to the Bay Area, and I went to Steve, and I should always preface this because Steve gets mad because when I say I came back to the Bay Area to talk to Steve, I came home, he always says, well, make it clear that we don't live together anymore. We're not like in bunk beds and, we're not at our mom's house anymore. So I came back to the Bay Area where we both happen to live in separate homes with our separate families. And we had always talked about doing a project together, and I said, look, this is what he knew what I'd been working on because we always talked to each other. And I said, what do you think about a book on this? And, I'm obviously biased as Steve's brother, but he is the best journalist I know. And among the many talents he has is seeing stories very clearly and seeing the nuance in stories and the depth in stories. And he immediately latched onto, as he began to read about this, more that this would be a great book. And one thing led to another, and we got in touch. We put together a proposal and we sent it out to our agent, who one thing led to another, and Crown Publishing, which is a division of Random House, decided they wanted to publish the book. And for us, when we began to think about what we wanted the story to be as we began to do research, one of the sort of fundamental questions that arose for us was, what did the NFL know and when did it know it? It was sort of the the most basic elemental question that would get to not only telling the stories of people who'd been affected by concussions, but also very clearly get to the institution of the NFL and the sort of policies that had dictated the way the league had managed the concussion issue for what had basically been 2 decades. So that was our launching point for the reporting, and we began at a place, again, of knowing very little. For both of us, it was a totally different experience than our previous books. Steve had written 2 before this, one off of his Pulitzer work at the Washington Post on the privatization of the war in Iraq, and that had been born out of all of the work he had done at the Post, much of it. My work on Game of Shadows, this book, on steroids, had been born out of years of reporting with my colleague Lance Williams at the Chronicle. So we both had a really good base of reporting when we went into that. With the concussion story, we knew nothing other than the reading that we had begun to do. So that was a dramatic shift for us. The other big difference that happened, and we'll probably get into this more later during some Q&A, but you know, we're both working at ESPN. We were sort of in this TV world. Our background is as print hacks, basically. We're just newspaper guys. And we had made the transition to ESPN amidst the sort of changing journalism world. And also, so TV had become a part of our lives in a way, or it was just beginning for Steve. It had been for me for several years. And around this same time, the PBS program Frontline expressed an interest through a former colleague of Steve's in doing a documentary based on the book. And again, Steve and I knew nothing about television and documentaries, but we thought, here's PBS Frontline, one of the most outstanding institutions in investigative journalism on television. What a great way to partner our work, provide more exposure for it, and all of that. And so about 6 months after we began reporting on the book, there was an official partnership created between Frontline and us on this book. And at the same time, the issue got even more complicated when ESPN, our employer, decided they wanted to be part of this partnership. They thought, yeah, this sounds like a good idea. We're going to benefit from the reporting that you're doing. Maybe you guys will do some stories for us. We'll work with Frontline and collaborate on this documentary, and it'll be a sort of win-win for everybody. But of course, underlying all of that was the very real issue that ESPN is a business partner with the NFL and spends about has a $15 billion contract to air Monday Night Football. And so you can sort of imagine where the tension begins to build around that very issue. For us, there was a very clear wall established as we began to do our reporting around this. We were just going to do what the reporting led us to and do those stories, and our bosses were very keen to report on that and present it. But it became a much more complicated issue as we got closer and closer to the publication of the book and the airing of the documentary. The more we found out, the more the tidal league of denial emerged, and the more people began to express their real concerns about the prevalence of brain damage in football. So I think that's a good place for me to hand off to my big brother and let him sort of expand on where the reporting began to take us and how we got to where we are now. So, Steve? I figured we'd get to it, but if you...
No, that's fine. Thanks so much. It's really, it really is an honor to be here. The only school of public service in the country, and for our work to be recognized as something in the arena of public service is just really gratifying because, of course, as Mark was describing, as we began to develop our work and the complicated tensions around it and the economics around professional football now, I don't think we were recognized by many people, particularly the National Football League, as performing a public service. So I'm really grateful. And, you know, it is true, as Mark alluded, you know, Mark always, I'm surprised he hasn't actually pointed this out. He's the younger brother, which he likes to point out constantly, mostly because people don't immediately recognize that he's the younger brother. But it's also not an uncomplicated thing to do a book with your brother, and you kind of revert really to the way you are when you're like a kid. But the difference is you can't just pound your younger brother when you're frustrated with him. You have to actually talk to him and reason with him. So as Mark said, when we began to talk about this book, and it was Mark's idea as introduced by Julian Bales, and he began to talk about it with me, it immediately struck me as a brilliant idea, in the sense that here you had all the classic elements of a big topic, an important topic. You had an incredibly powerful corporation whose product is also embedded in the culture of the country. You had the growing realization that this product was now implicated in what was becoming a very serious public health crisis. And the tension involved in that, I think, struck us both as something that was very rich journalistically, but also something that we could hopefully shed some light on as people, parents, fans, players, were beginning to try to sort out what to do about it. Should we let our kids play? Should I continue to play? How do we deal with this on a number of different levels? And so we basically started the way a lot of journalists do. We started from the beginning, and so we decided to go back to sort of the beginning of the story for the National Football League, and that's what led us to a guy named Bennett Amalu. Amalu was a pathologist who worked in the coroner's office in Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And Amalu is an unusual guy. He was Nigerian. He was one of 7 pathologists who were working in the coroner's office at the time. And the only reason really he came into our story and became such an important part of our book was that he just happened to be working on the day that Mike Webster, the Hall of Fame center for the Pittsburgh Steelers, was brought into his body was brought into the coroner's office. He had died at the age of 50 of a heart attack. Amalu knew absolutely nothing about football. He told us that when he first entered into this issue, he had never heard of the Super Bowl. He wasn't aware of what the Super Bowl was. He certainly was probably the most ignorant person in Pittsburgh around the issues about the Pittsburgh Steelers, which of course, as most people know, is a rabidly fanatical football town. But he had sort of 3 things going for him at the time. One was that he had just finished his studies in neuropathology, which are the studies of brain disease. He had studied at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is a very prestigious institution. Another thing was that he had been an intern in the coroner's office at a time where he studied a case of domestic violence where a woman was battered, and then he autopsied her brain and found that she had severe brain disease. And although he didn't publish anything on that case, he was very curious. He found significant brain damage and was curious about sort of what the effects of the abuse that she had gone through had on her brain. And then the other thing was that he had seen the issues around Webster in the news. So Mike Webster, for those of you who don't know, was a Hall of Fame center for the Steelers. He was the anchor of the Pittsburgh Steelers dynasty in the 70s when the Steelers won 4 Super Bowls. He was very much a guy who was seen as being almost symbolic of the personality of the region. Blue-collar guy, had an incredibly tough guy, played at one point I think 6,000 consecutive plays. He refused to come off the field, and people loved him for it. He was a center, which is probably the most anonymous position on the field, and yet he was a superstar in Pittsburgh. And so when he began to get sick, it became a very big deal in Pittsburgh. And the issues surrounding Webster were extreme. People began to understand sort of what he was going through. He had been seen sleeping in the Pittsburgh Greyhound station. He seemed to be homeless. He would sleep in his truck at times and sort of wander the highways between Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. He was in an incredible amount of pain after his career, and as a mechanism to treat that pain and allow himself to sleep because he had such incredible trouble sleeping, he would literally use a stun gun to put himself out, and he would have his sons and his friends hit him with a stun gun to put him out. He started supergluing his teeth, which were falling out, back into his mouth. Mark and I, during the course of our research, found out that he was writing thousands and thousands of letters, which in many ways documented his descent into what really can only be described as madness. He was literally going crazy. And in these letters, it was incredibly disturbing because you could watch a person losing their mind in real time. And so at the beginning, many of these letters are sort of frantic pleas for help. And by the end, the letters are literally incomprehensible. You can't make heads or tails out of them. And yet, Webster is writing and writing and writing. And people in Pittsburgh began to become aware of this. And so Amalu saw Webster's case on the news, and he was curious. He was wondering sort of whether there might be a connection between Webster's football career and what had happened to him. And so that day, when Webster's body arrived at the Allegheny County Coroner's Office, Amalu made what we describe in our book as a fateful decision, a decision that really turned that day into one of the most historic days in the history of sports in our country. And that decision was that he was going to harvest Mike Webster's brain, put it in a jar of formalin to preserve it, and then slice it into very microscopic pieces and examine it and try to determine what had happened. And what he found was that Webster's brain had experienced this accumulation of a protein called tau, which is an abnormal protein that in certain circumstances can literally strangle brain cells. It's one of the biomarkers that's found in Alzheimer's disease. It's found in other neurodegenerative disease, but it had taken on a very specific and a unique pattern in Webster's brain, and it had literally caused him to go crazy. Amalu was taken aback because he knew intuitively that this was something big, and he took it to his mentor, who was a neuropathologist at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center named Ron Hamilton, and he tried to get him to guess like who this was. He didn't tell Hamilton whose brain these slides belonged to. He didn't say anything. He just basically said, "Who do you think this is? What do you think has happened to this man?" And first thing Hamilton said was, well, it must be a boxer, because at that point, brain damage in professional boxers had been known up since the 1920s, right? And so this was not something that was necessarily unusual. And Amalu said, no, it's not a boxer. And then Hamilton finally gave up, and Amalu said, it's a professional football player. It's Mike Webster. And Hamilton, as he describes it, his jaw literally dropped because he knew immediately the implications for our most beloved sport, our biggest sport, our national pastime. And as he described it to us, he said he knew immediately that this was, as he described it, $1 billion discovery. So, as Mark said, the question for us as journalists was, how did the NFL respond to this information? The implications were obvious. If the sport, everybody knows that football is violent. It's one of the reasons we all love the sport. But if it's known that the sport itself is inherently dangerous or even deadly, that it can destroy one's identity, and that's something that is happening in large numbers, how does this sport, which is also a $10 billion corporation, respond? And that's sort of the question that Mark and I set out to answer. As he put it, what did the NFL know and when did it know it? And what we discovered was that the NFL, from the very beginning, set out to essentially bury this information. And so they did this in ways that were actually quite public. And we sort of pride ourselves in being investigative reporters, but in fact, it really didn't require an enormous amount of investigation because the NFL had so publicly gone about this campaign. They put together what they called a mild traumatic brain injury committee in 1994. And to head it, the former NFL commissioner, Paul Tagliabue, assigned not a brain doctor, not anybody who had even expertise in concussions, but his own personal physician who was also a rheumatologist. And they packed that committee with NFL doctors, the same people who had been sending players back on the field for years. And then that committee, from a period of 2003 to 2009, put out 17 scientific papers in which they basically said that football players don't get brain damage, and that concussions are minor injuries, and that that really there's nothing to worry about. Sort of the overall message of these papers was basically turn away. And Mark and I are reading these papers, and I think, frankly, like not a lot of people had read them, and we're sort of reading this and going, "You got to be kidding me!" It's just like it doesn't really pass the logic test. One particular phrase leaped out at us. The NFL's scientific research arm concluded that professional football players do not sustain frequent repetitive blows to the brain on a regular basis. Well, anybody who watches football on Sunday knows that that's probably not true. And then with people like Bennett Amalu, they just tried to squash them. They use all their media power and all their economic power to basically try to marginalize those people. And so with Amalu, they went to the scientific publication in which he was going to publish his findings about Webster, and they tried to get them to retract the paper, which is an incredibly unusual thing in the scientific community. It's like, you usually don't do that unless there are issues around fraud or plagiarism or something like that. Just because you disagree or may disagree with the findings, you don't try to get a paper literally stricken from the record. It's a sort of a career-killing action to take. And then there were other people who were also doing research into this and finding very disturbing things, that NFL players seem to have dramatically higher incidence of depression, dramatically higher incidence of incipient dementia. And with those people, they were coming out publicly and denying those findings as well. And so that was the NFL's MO, basically for a period of between 1994 and 2009, until other journalists and Congress and the science finally caught up with them, and then they began to deal with this. So we enter into this in 2012, and I'll kind of finish off the story where Mark left it, which is we had this sort of confluence of entities that got involved in our project. So you had Frontline, which was going to do a documentary. You had ESPN, which is our employer, that also has this huge contract with the NFL. You have the NFL itself. And then you have our publisher, Crown. And we're now 7 weeks from publication of our book and 7 weeks from the air date of our documentary. And what we know is that at that point, the trailer for our documentary then began to circulate. And of course, the name of it, League of Denial, was going to raise serious issues for the NFL. And then you had, in this trailer, you had one scientist saying, we don't really know where this stops. She feared that every single football player may have some form of neurodegenerative disease as a result of the sport. And at that moment, what we know is that there was a lunch between the commissioner of the NFL, Roger Goodell, and the president of ESPN, John Skipper. We know it's been reported that Goodell expressed his extreme displeasure over ESPN's participation in this film. And 3 days later, Mark and I got a call from our bosses at ESPN telling us that ESPN had withdrawn from the film and was no longer going to be a partner on this. And so that, of course, was extremely alarming and distressing to us, and obviously indicative of the different forces that were at work. And I think what's been really gratifying for us in the end is that the NFL, if in fact it did take action to try to apply pressure around our work, was unsuccessful because the document aired as completely intact. Our book came out on schedule. ESPN, even though they had taken their name off of the film, then broadcast excerpts of it and helped us promote it, frankly, by putting us on the air. And so the power of the book, ironically, the power of the material such as it is, I think that the NFL's actions in some ways amplified it because it laid in sort of very stark relief kind of what the different forces were in play here. And that's sort of where we are today. So I think with that, we'd be happy to take any of your questions.
Well, thank you guys very much. And by the way, it is public service. Thank you. Questions? Yes. Mr. Craig O'Neill. Yeah, it's on. You also know shoes.
Shoes and mics. Do you all have a grasp as to, let's say I went into the NFL, I was drafted into the NFL. What are my chances of brain damage?
I mean, I think this is one of the interesting questions. The science is very much continuing to emerge on this issue. At this point, there have been, I think it's 52 brains of former NFL players. This disease that Bennett Amalu discovered in football players for the first time in 2005, at this point can only be diagnosed posthumously in death. So at this point, there have been 52 brains of former players that have been studied. Of those 51 or 50, I think it's 50 or 51, have shown signs of this disease. 50 out of 52. So obviously that's quite a high number. At the same time, the folks who are doing this research will be the first to admit that they're looking at a skewed data set because they're only looking at brains that have been sent to them, largely specifically because families have concerns about these former players who've been suffering some sorts of issues. And so, what remains to be seen is what is that prevalence going to be? How extreme is it when you do a real longitudinal study that looks at players now while they're still in the game, through retirement and into death? And ultimately, there's also, we're on the verge, if not already there, of a test that's going to diagnose this in living players. So that could also change the discussion about prevalence. But I think that, Steve referenced one of the doctors who's been doing the most research on this at this point is a woman named Ann McKee at Boston University. And she's seen more brains than any other, more brains of former NFL players than anyone. And she's the one in the documentary who says she expresses fear that she's going to see that every former NFL player has some form of this disease. But again, she's gotten a lot of hostility from some in the research community about that statement.
Jay, right here.
Can you talk a little bit about the supposed settlement and where the legal issues, what are legal dangers for the NFL going forward?
Sure. So the NFL was sued by more than 4,000 former players for allegedly concealing the link between football and brain damage during this period that I described. They arrived at a settlement for $765 million last August?
Yeah.
Last August. And it was right before the NFL season, and so the school of thought at the time was that that was probably going to put an end to the NFL's sort of biggest exposure legally. But what's happened since is that the judge about 3 months ago rejected the settlement, arguing that that both the NFL and the plaintiffs had not provided enough evidence to show that all the players who were in need of help would be covered by this money. So where it stands now is that they're going to have to try again and see if they can get the settlement through. And I think there's an expectation that there will be some changes to whatever settlement they come forward with. But we were talking about this just before we were at the event. I think we're in kind of an unknown territory now because since then there have been other suits that have been filed. So it's clear that this isn't going to end the litigation against the league. In many ways, it's just starting. The NCAA is also facing litigation. High school districts are beginning to face litigation. I mean, so this is going to be legally an issue for many years to come, and that's going to raise questions, I think, around the settlement, because if the NFL's goal by settling with the players was to get rid of it and sort of move on, it's becoming increasingly clear that that's not going to happen. And so will they want to stick with this settlement, especially if they have to put more money into it? So I guess we don't really know, but I think the sort of the bottom line is that it's not nearly over.
Question right here. We'll get somebody here. We got.
In your book, you also deal with the helmet maker. I believe it's Riddell. Is that how they pronounce it?
Yes.
Last month, the University of Arkansas head football coach Brett Bielema tweeted that the Razorbacks would be wearing this new type of helmet called a Speed Flex. And Riddell is claiming that the Speed Flex disperses the energy when the player suffers a hit, and that reduces trauma. And that there is also some type of software built into it that will alert the sidelines that this player has possibly suffered a concussion or a potentially concussive hit. Do you have any comments on the validity of that?
Go ahead.
I mean, one of the fascinating things I think both of us saw as we began to do the research around this issue, as the concussion issue grew and grew in sort of public awareness, there were several different niches that sort of created around it. One of them was a real a capitalism, actually, sort of around the issue of concussions. And you've seen just a wealth of products that have been created around this concern. Steve and I would get, whenever we do a story, we would get emails every time, just endless streams of emails from makers of helmets, from sensors, people who were mouth guards. Everybody seemed to have an answer for the concussion issue. The sensor issue inside helmets has been an ongoing piece of the puzzle for a while now, as has the suggestion that there can be a helmet. This is part of where Riddell got into trouble, and we detail this in the book. There's a period where they create a helmet called the Revolution, and do some research through researchers who are working with the NFL, and eventually argue that the Revolution reduces the rate of concussions by 31%. A piece of data that ends up being the target of an investigation by the FTC, and later Riddell retracts that 31% claim. When you talk to scientists who've been studying this for decades now, the one consensus seems to be that there is no helmet that will solve this issue, at least now. The helmet was created as a means of protecting against skull fractures. When we went from leather to plastic, and it's done a fantastic job of that. It reduces skull fractures. The reality, though, is it's had the opposite effect as it relates to concussions and that kind of damage, because it's a weapon, right? It weaponized football in a way that it hadn't been when leather helmets were in play. When people talk now about changes to the game, the sort of extreme reaction is, well, maybe we should just go back to leather, because that's a time when players were much more conscious of worrying about running into each other's heads. We're clearly not going back to leather, but the helmet is a weapon in this way that leather was not.
We've got some questions back here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your work. It really is important. You spoke a lot about the dynamics at play with institutions like the NFL, ESPN, and I know, Steve, that you used to work at the Bay Citizen. And thinking about nonprofits.
You've done some excellent research on my brother.
Thank
That's
you.
good.
The short-lived.
But the idea of nonprofits, a lot of times we hear about how we have transparency in government. And I'm curious as to what kind of changes could we have so that the nonprofits like the NFL, large ones that have huge interests, financial interests, and including smaller ones, whether they're investigative journalism or anything like that, just have better structure so there can be transparency and that the people they serve and work in those organizations can actually be protected.
I don't honestly know the answer to that question, really. I think with regard to the NFL, one thing that I think that was striking to Mark and me as we were doing the book, we draw parallels in the book between what happened with the NFL and what happened with the tobacco industry. That when it was discovered fairly conclusively that smoking was linked to a whole range of very serious health problems, the tobacco industry attacked scientists, set up their own research arms, did a lot of things that are very similar to what the NFL did in their own time of crisis. And I've kind of personally sort of, now watching what's playing out with General Motors, and I've kind of sort of coming to the conclusion that almost like this is how these institutions react instinctively to protect their to protect their own interests. I think it's I think the knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, that the government has to be, or the people who are watching over these and regulating these industries have to be more aggressive. But I mean, at the same time, my own personal feeling is like, do we really want the government regulating football? I mean, no. For me, no, personally. And so where does that leave us? Because as Mark said, now it's not only that the NFL is a corporation, it's that the business of concussions, the medical issues of concussions have now become sort of, what's the word, like corporatized. And so, how is the market going to really sort of take care of that? I don't really know. It's a long-winded answer of saying, like, I really don't know. I mean, the NFL has sort of limited nonprofit status. It's a corporation. And I don't think that the answer is in that issue, actually. It's somewhere else, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, when we were talking a little bit about the litigation and the theory behind it, you talked about it being like this was a fraudulent sort of concealment of the danger you were in, which in my mind kind of linked to something like a worker and asbestos. And so I kept thinking about that and thought, well, I wonder, will there ever be any sort of legislative solution? And I know you just said that you don't like the idea of government regulating football, which I'm sure a lot of people don't, but my question is is there anything like that on the horizon or that y'all have encountered in this research?
Well, like the state concussion legislation.
Right. I mean, I think there's two pieces to that. I mean, I'll say this first clearly for both Steve and me. I often don't speak for him, but I will. I will now. Both of us, I think, agree we don't want the NFL to change. The sport is what it is, and I think one of the reasons we love it, and a lot of people love it, is because it is what it's violent. Steve has 49ers season tickets. We watch games together all the time. We love the sport, and I think the disservice that was done for 2 decades was the league denying to players this sort of connection, and that a player who's playing now cannot argue anymore that he doesn't know. But I think the question that does have to get answered and to be dealt with on a for at least to us, and I think most people more seriously, is what happens at the youth level. And so in terms of legislation, you're seeing there's a number of states that have now adopted laws around coaching education, around the treatment of concussions for players at the high school and Pop Warner level. So you're seeing more of that. Whether that ends up making a difference or not at those levels, I don't think anybody knows yet. We were talking before, Steve and I did a story for ESPN 3 months ago that stated that talked about the decline of participation rates in Pop Warner football. It's down 10% now in the last 2 years. And the medical director for Pop Warner actually is Julian Bales, the guy we talked about earlier. And Julian flat out says that that's attributable to the concerns that parents are having about concussions and the long-term effects of that. So, I think all of that remains to be seen how it plays out and whether legislation plays a role in changing the culture of football at the youth level. The NFL is pouring millions of dollars into this issue around trying to train coaches to change the way players tackle. We did a long piece on that a while back. Can you really do that? Can you actually take the head out of the sport? That seems a pretty far-fetched idea, but some people believe it's possible. So I think a lot, in many ways, we are really in the early stages of where this is headed.
Yes, we got 2 questions at the back. We'll get both of them.
When I saw your presentation on Frontline, I realized I had an untreated concussion from 8th grade football off a Rydell helmet. So my question is, how do you combat coaches who have the mentality that they make fun of injuries? And the second question is, dealing with the outside the lines feature, how did that change some of this, especially with regard to the doctor you mentioned for the NFL?
The last part of your question, I didn't quite follow. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
it was dealing with the outside the lines
Yeah.
report about this, and y'all mentioned the doctor earlier.
Yeah, Dr. Amalu.
Yeah, what?
Yeah.
No, not him, but the one who was for the NFL.
Oh, right. Elliot Pellman, right.
Yeah, what happened to him?
Right. Oh, right. I think that there's, with respect to the culture of football, my own opinion is that it's kind of, there's 2 issues. There's one, sort of the youth football issue, and then there's the pros. In the pros, I don't think you're ever going to eliminate this culture. It's embedded in the structure of the business. I mean, I think one thing that we forget when we're watching these guys is that this is their livelihood. And, as Mark said, I'm a 49er season ticket holder. And for those of you who follow the team a little bit, you know that a couple years ago, Alex Smith, who was the quarterback, got a concussion. I was at that game. He disappeared from the field. Nobody had any idea what had happened to him. Colin Kaepernick came in and took his place, and Smith never saw the field again. I mean, now he's in Kansas City. And so the implications are obvious that if you sit out and don't go back on the field, your livelihood is at stake. The way you support your family is at stake. And so I just don't see that culture ever being eradicated from the NFL. With the youth level, I think it is incumbent on the coaches to take the initiative to get kids off the field and to be able to recognize that. But the one thing I would say is that in the limited sort of exposure that Mark and I have had to youth football, the coaches they get caught up in it like everybody else, and the culture is play and play through pain, and I don't know how it's gonna take some time, I think, to change that. Elliot Pellman, the rheumatologist who was also Paul Tagliabue's personal physician, who headed the NFL's research arm into this, continues to work for the NFL, much to the amazement of nearly everybody who's involved in this issue, and no one's really ever explained why. But he is the NFL's medical director, and he's still involved in this issue in many ways.
Alex, you got a question? Then we got.
Yes, thank you both for coming today. It was really great to hear you guys talk about the project that you've been working on. Simple question is, first off, what do you think the NFL will look like in another 20 years? You have parents who are pulling their kids out. You have President Obama saying if he had boys that he probably wouldn't have them play football. And so So the very potential workforce is, as you just illustrated, decreasing by 10%, et cetera. And somewhat related to that, a second question of, I know there's been a lot of recent talk with Northwestern and unionizing players at the non-professional level, the college level. And some of that, a portion of that perhaps, is related to health issues and these student athletes and having protection and having some sort of safety net, if you will, if something happens. And so all of this moving forward, do you see the NFL just becoming like boxing, where it still exists, but it's not nearly what it was 40 years ago, 50 years ago? Do you think the technology can catch up, or who knows? We'll just wait and see.
You preface this with, this is a simple question. There's nothing simple about it. I mean, the very simple answer is I have no idea. I mean, I think we really don't. I think Steve says this often, and I really do agree with him, that where the science goes will dictate a lot of this, I think. I always say it's just impossible for us to believe right now that the NFL could go away, right? I mean, the way it's entrenched in our lives, it's a $10 billion industry. The commissioner has, I think, publicly stated he hopes for it to be a $25 billion industry within a decade. So, the idea that football would somehow go away seems crazy to us. At the same time, there are people make that analogy to boxing, where decades ago it was a huge sort of entrenched part of our culture, and now it's sort of it's often this sort of side piece, almost likened to MMA and others. So but I think we won't know really until the science begins to emerge around what is the prevalence. But I do, the other piece of that too is, and this is maybe true for where boxing was before, but Steve has said this many times also, that when the analogy about smoking breaks down when you start to talk about its place in the culture, because of course none of us really miss like smoking on flights anymore, or being in a restaurant and somebody sitting right next to you and smoking. There's nobody like ruining the day. When can we go back to that? But clearly, for a large segment of the population, if you lost football, the NFL, that would be that would have a huge impact on our culture. I mean, 110 million people watched the Super Bowl this past year, compared to 10 million people who watched Breaking Bad's finale. So, this is such an important piece of the way we sort of do business in our society that I think, that would be dramatic. But I don't think we really know until we get further down the road with the science.
I think that's an important point too. Like that, we're the NFL. We who love football, we're the reason why it's so huge. And I do think that the science is going to. I really do believe this. The science is going to lead this. If it turns out that half of all NFL players are having their identities destroyed shortly after they end their careers, that's going to have sort of implications for the people who play it. But I also think it's going to have implications for the people like us who watch it, because there will become a moment where we're sort of like, well, what are we rooting for exactly, right? And I think some people are there already. I'm not, but I feel like there's some threshold there that will turn it into a more of a moral issue than it already is, and it'd be interesting to see sort of how those issues track in a parallel way, I think.
Simon, you got a question back there?
You mentioned the litigation at the college level and also at the school district level. I would assume, particularly at a school district, that the scientific resources aren't great. Is the indication that most of the concussion theories and thinking comes from the bad science at the NFL, or are there indications that there were pockets of good yet repressed at the NCAA level?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one I don't think either of us know the answer to. We haven't spent a lot of time researching the NCAA, or frankly any time really researching what the NCAA did. There's a very public body of evidence around the NFL's research, and I haven't seen anybody trot out, you know, there are people who've been covering the NCAA story. I haven't seen anybody trot out the sort of the NCAA's public, you know, one thing I think I know, I think this is right, you should double check it if you're writing about it, but I think somebody pointed out the NCAA didn't even have a medical director, at least focused on this issue until the last couple of years. So I think that's probably a fairly meaningful piece of data if it's true. But I don't know the contours of that lawsuit in the way we do the NFL suit.
Look, we could go on. This is, you know, this is a topic that is so interesting, so important, so cultural in terms of our way of life. 110 million watching the Super Bowl, 50 out of 52 brains with a disease as a result of brain injury. So they're going to be around here signing their book, League of Denial. You all come up and ask them individual questions. This is a great public service to talk about this subject, and I think we'll continue to hear more about it, those who may agree, those who may disagree, but the truth of the matter is pretty factual knowledge here in League of Denial. Let's welcome and thank Steve and Mark for